Elisha, and then he's able to operate in that. He was chosen as the next prophet. Well, you also had Moses. Moses, when he led Israel, it says for Joshua that the spirit of Moses went on to Joshua, and so he was qualified to lead. So the spirit of Samuel was put on Saul, and that's why he began prophesying, because Samuel was a prophet. And so whenever Saul, it was proof to the people that the spirit of Samuel is upon him, and he is now chosen as the next king to be ruling Israel. So what I wanted to, there's so much with Saul. He did a very good job in the beginning. He loved the Lord. He was obedient. And then he started to fall away, and things started to happen, and he began to be disobedient. But there's one story I want to hone in on and really give you the background to have a better understanding. Most of you should know the story about when Samuel was supposed to offer the Samuel was supposed to offer the sacrifice before the battle, and then Saul's waiting, and Samuel doesn't come, and so he just hastily does it, and then Samuel comes and rebukes him. So let me give you this, what's going on, the background of this story. So we have the Philistines, and the Philistines were a huge enemy of Israel. So here's the Israelites pretty much, and they set up 3 encampments around Israel. I'll make it better. It was more like this, and then over here. So these 3 encampments of Philistines were surrounding Israel, and Saul and his men, he had 600 men, that they were here in between in the middle. And so they were supposed to fight. Now, the problem is that the Philistines had the weapons, and Israel did not, because the Philistines figured out how to take iron from the earth and develop it into weapons. The Israelites didn't know that trick, so they didn't have any weapons. Only Saul and Jonathan had weapons. 2 men out of the entire 600-man army had weapons. No one else did. They just came with themselves. And so they are surrounded by Philistines who are warriors with weapons, ready to fight, and it's scary. If you know, unless God is with us, we are going to die, because my hand is not going to cut compared to a sword. So these men were fearful, and Saul is getting anxious. Where's Samuel? Where's Samuel? He said he was going to be here, and it's been past the time he said. And so he thinks the men are like, we're just going to go home. We don't want to do this anymore. This is not going to work out. God's not for us. So Saul says, okay, I'll do it. And he offers us this sacrifice, and then here comes Samuel. And he walks up and says, Saul, what have you done? You were disobedient to the Lord. I told you I would come. Just wait, and you refused to wait. And that's when Saul is told, because you did this, God said he would have set up your kingdom forever, but because you did this, he's taking it away and giving it to another, which was David, but Saul didn't know that. So then Samuel leaves. He leaves. And so Saul's there, ready to fight, and he doesn't know what to do. And some of the men, they're hiding. They're going into, says, bushes and brush, they're not wanting to fight. And some of them were already on the other side. They just went over and said, we surrender, we'll come and fight with you, because they had no weapons. So the Philistines are like, sure, come on. So they had all these things, and then here comes Jonathan. And Jonathan said, what if the Lord is going to deliver us? It doesn't matter if there's many of us or few. The Lord will do what he wants to do. So he had the faith to know that God could deliver them from the army. So he told his armor bearer, so Saul and his men, they're all hunched up there, not doing anything yet. And so Jonathan says, let's go. Just you and I. We're going to go. We're going to fight men, and we're going to have the Lord deliver them into our hands. So he has a sword. His armor bearer does not. So he goes up to one of these encampments, and it's pretty much, it says it's on a hillside, like a cliff area that they had to climb. And so he tells his armor bearer, he says, if we call up to them and they say, wait, we'll come down to you, then we'll wait. But if they say, no, come on up to us and fight, then we know that the Lord has given them into our hands. So they go over and they call up to the Philistines, and the Philistines look down and they see 2 men, one with a sword and one without a sword, and they're like, yeah, come on up, come on, we'll take care of you. So he comes up, he climbs up, he knows that the Lord is giving him into his hands, and at this top part of the cliff, there's about 20 men. And within a short amount of time, it says that Jonathan, first he kills most of them, by the sword, and then he gives it to his armor bearer, and his armor bearer kills the rest of them. And it created such a fear, because the Philistines, they didn't understand what was going on. They just looked over and they saw all these men dropping, and it was What? Wait, no. Like, they have the weapons. Israel doesn't have the weapons. Why are our men getting defeated? And so they began to freak out, thinking, well, did Israel call, someone else to help them? Is there another enemy that we didn't know about? And so they start, they come over and they start getting real shaking. And it says that that the Lord caused the ground to shake. So that caused so much commotion that they started fighting each other. And they started killing off each other. And then over here, you have Saul. And Saul looks over and he sees there's all this commotion and rumbling and the earth is quaking, and he thinks, what is going on? What happened? So he looks around because he didn't know that Jonathan had left, and they do a census. They figure out Jonathan and his armor bearer aren't here. So he says, well, let's go help them. And so they get ready to fight, and they're ready to go down to the army, and then they see that Jonathan and his armor bearer are coming up, and they're like, okay, no, wait, let's hold off, because the Lord is with them. The Lord is starting to deliver our enemies. And so the men that were hiding came out of hiding because they saw the Philistines are all in this commotion, fighting each other, and they began to join Saul and his army. And the ones that were over here in the Philistine side that had surrendered turn against the Philistines because they see the Lord is with the Israelites, and they fight the Philistines, and they win. And it's this huge victory from two men that had, well, I shouldn't say from two men. God did the victory, but only two men in the Israelite army had weapons, and the Lord was able to defeat thousands of Philistines that were there trying to surround them. So that happened with Saul, and there was a lot of other things that happened with his chase with David. Once he finds out that David is the one that he felt like the Lord has chosen for the next king, he begins hunting him down, trying to kill him, and there's this whole cat and mouse chase that goes around. But I'm not going to hone in too much on that. I wanted to continue on with our week. So David was a type of Christ because his kingdom foreshadows a millennial kingdom because Jesus came from the line of David. So when God gave David a covenant, it was three things: is that his line would endure forever, his kingdom would continue permanently, and that his throne would never pass away. So David's kingdom is going to last forever. He's being told that, and it's unconditional. It's not like David and his generations have to do certain things for that to be fulfilled. God says, this is going to happen on my account, regardless of your actions. And so we know that whenever it comes to prophecy, that it's progressive. It's progressively revealed. So in the beginning, after the fall, we had the Messiah's coming, and we know that it's going to be through the line of a woman. It's going to be the offspring of a woman. But that's all they knew. And then 2,000 years later, God said, okay, the Messiah is going to come through Abraham now. And then 1,000 years later, now the Messiah is going to come through David's line, and his kingdom is going to last forever. So it's like these mountain peaks where you have, prophecy, and then nothing happens for a while, and then prophecy, and then nothing happens for a while. And so that's how it is even with our day, where it's like the end times and all these things. Well, we're waiting for them to be fulfilled. When is soon? God's coming back soon, and it's been 2,000 years. Well, 2,000 years went by before the next clue about the Messiah was revealed. So God does not look at time. He just looks at, it's coming. I can see the line, it's coming, and that we should just trust him and know that it will come as he said. So back then, when they had this whole cat and mouse chase with David and Saul, and you think, why didn't David just kill Saul? Why didn't he just get it over with? There were so many opportunities where Saul seemed to be sleeping at his feet, and David could have just right then and there. And he kept saying, no, I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. So let me explain why. So back then, the pagan thought was that the divine kings were God incarnate. So I kind of highlighted that weeks ago, where it's like, when they were king, it was like the God indwelled within them. So what they said was pretty much a spokesman for their God. But with the Hebrews, the kings were sacred and chosen by God, and it could only be removed by God. So man should not remove a king. It should only be God. If God pulled out Saul and chose Saul, then God will be the one to take him off the throne, not people. So that's why David was so insistent on not touching God's anointed. And it said that Saul was holy. So sometimes when we think of the word holy, we think of you have less sin, that you're trying to be good and righteous the way the Lord wants you to be. But the Jews, the word holy did not mean that. It meant set apart. So Saul was set apart as Israel's king, and so he was holy, regardless of his actions. He was set apart and holy so that he was not to be harmed. God had to take that holy vessel off of his throne and then put on someone else and set them apart as holy as well. So David then becomes king. So we're going to stop here in the history and go into, Evan, if you could put the slide on, the poetry books. So we're going to have a little bit of English class. Okay, so with the poetry books, there are 5 poetry books. You have Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job that are considered the poetry book. So there is some history in it with Job, but the reason Job is considered a poetry book is because of his dialogue with his friends, and when God speaks to Job, all of that is in very poetic, Jewish poetic form, and so that's why they consider it a poetry book, even though in the beginning and the end have this little history tidbit about Job's life. But we'll get into that in a minute. So the poetry books were written between 1500 and 900 BC, and it was very hard to translate because Hebrew poetry had all these words that people did not understand. And so when they were trying to translate it into the Greek format, the Septuagint, when they made the whole Old Testament into Greek so that the church in the early church that were Greeks, that were not Jews, they didn't know how to read Jewish. So you're giving them the Torah in Hebrew, and they're like, I don't know how to read that. So they translated the entire Old Testament into Greek so that they could read it, and they knew how to follow it. So when they were doing that, they were looking at the Jewish poetry books, and it was confusing. A lot of the words were not used several times in order to understand their meaning. It was like maybe once or twice. And you were like, well, maybe it means this, maybe it doesn't mean this. So there was this amazing find in kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know how the Dead Sea Scrolls were amazing find? 1929, in this city called Ugarit. So Evan, can you do the next slide? I know this is a very small map. I tried to enlarge it and it wasn't working. But if you look at, there is on the far left, you see the little water, says, Egypt, and it's on the left side of Egypt. If you go up the water line with the land, you see that little dot where it says U. You can see the U. Can you see the U? Ugarit. That's Ugarit. So it's a port city. It's a city that was used as trade. It was very important in the day. Very, very important. And I'll go into that later when the Assyrians were Assyria. They come up, and once they capture Ugarit, it's like Israel knows it's over. If they can capture Ugarit, then there's nothing they can't capture. And that's where it's like they're coming, and then Israel gets real anxious, and we'll talk about that later. But that city, Ugarit, their language was so close to the Hebrew language, it was almost identical. And so when Assyria came and captured Ugarit, it was like they captured it and then they took all the people away and they just left it. They didn't destroy it. They just kind of left everything. So there was all these tablets, there was all these finds that just got buried over time because no one else occupied it after that point. It was just kind of left for thousands of years. And then it said in 1929, they were over there and they were doing some certain diggings because they were finding some other artifacts, and they hit this building and they thought, so they dug it up and they thought, maybe it's some sort of like a marketplace, but it ended up being a library. And they found in the library hundreds of these tablets, and these tablets had all this Hebrew poetry and all these words that are found in the Old Testament in the poetry books. And now we can understand their meaning because they're used so many times in these finds. So this was like a revelation to, now we can understand all these poetry books, and let's, understand what they were saying. Because before, the scholars and the commentators, like if you go back before 1929, they'll say the Hebrew poetry is broken, and it wasn't done right, and so they said they would try to fix it and translate it more Greek. So I talked about the difference between the Hebrews and the Greeks were abstract, the Hebrews are very concrete, and so it's like, the whole thing about that God is when he's slow to anger, and it actually says slow to nose, because a nose meant anger to the Hebrews. And so the Greeks would look at that and say, that's stupid. Like, what? Nose? So they would kind of say, this is wrong. We just need to fix it. And so they would try to fix all of this poetry books into Greek, and it didn't match. It didn't look right. It didn't understand right. So I'm going to give you examples. Evan, can you do the next one? So the King James Version was translated before 1929. And so because of that, they did not have this find, and so they decided to translate what they believed each of these words meant. So this is why there's a lot of controversy amongst people, and they'll say, well, there's words in the King James that aren't in the, NASB or the NIV or any of these new ones, so they're wrong and the King James is right. I don't know if you've heard that, but I have. All over social media, there's a group of people, they're very strong and very passionate about it. But the problem is that there are issues in the King James because they didn't have the complete knowledge when they were translating. And there was a lot of errors that were made because it was by King James that ordered it, and he rushed the whole thing to get done very quickly. And so it was done by one commentator, one translator, and he did it very fast. And so there were some different translations that are different translating from Hebrew and Greek into the English that were a little wrong. The numbers were off, and some other things were off. But the truth is still there. So that's where I say, I don't care what version that you read, but know that whatever version it is, it's the biblical truth doesn't change. The words might change. It might sound different in this one and this one, but when you use just one translation only, it's almost, you need to be careful because sometimes, like I'll show you, for example, with the King James, they might have gotten some words wrong, and you're like, no, but it says. And if you look at other translations and say, what is the meaning behind it, you can get a better understanding of what God was trying to say. So in Deuteronomy, ye shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire. So the word that is translated for groves was an unknown word. They didn't know what it meant. And they thought, burn, it's like breaking, overthrowing, burning. Well, you burn trees, so maybe that's what it means, like groves of trees. So they put in trees because you're burning them with fire. What else would you burn with fire? Okay, 2 Chronicles 34:7. And when he had broken down the altars and the groves and had beaten the graven images into powder. So what are you breaking? You're breaking altars, you're breaking down trees. Okay, that's what they thought. They thought they understand the Hebrew verb in those sentences, and so they thought, well, that's what you burn and that's what you break. Okay, can you do the next slide? Okay, so I'm going to take the first one. The groves. They found out that the word with the Ugarit, find, they found out that that word was Asherim. So Asherim was Asherah poles. So we had Baal, or Baal, and he was supposed to be the all-powerful God, kind of like a Zeus. Like he's the one that was over of everything. He was the all-powerful one. Well, he was supposed to be married to Asherah, and Asherah was the goddess of fertility and love. And so that's why whenever they would have their temple set up, you would have these temple prostitutes and did all these things where they would have like Baal and Asherah get married, and then that way the kingdom has prosperity and everything's so wonderful, and we're having all this food growing up, and our animals are fertile, and all these different things. So what Israel decided to do is they said, at certain times they worship Baal, but whenever a king would come in and say, that's wrong, we shouldn't worship Baal anymore, they would say, okay, not Baal, but at least Asherah. So it would say when you're reading the text, it'll say they destroyed the temples, but they still had some Asherah temples and poles and mounds that they would worship to. And you think, what? Like, what? That doesn't even make sense. You're trying to make your life right with the Lord, and so you break down one big thing, but you're keeping the small stuff because you think it's little. It's just an Asherah pole. It's just asking for extra help just in case God doesn't hear me, okay? So that's what they would do. And so Asherim is Asherah poles, okay? It's the plural form of Asherah poles, is Asherim. So that's what it meant. It wasn't trees. They weren't burning any trees. They were burning the Asherim with fire. They were saying, we're going to cleanse the land. We're going to cleanse our spiritual lives. We're breaking down every pole, every altar that stands itself against the Lord. And that's what they did. So it was translated in the New American Standard as Asherim after this find. King James is always going to be the same because it was written that long ago. Evan, can you do the next slide? So again, in this one, About the groves, breaking down the altars and the groves, well, it's beating down the Asherim. It's breaking down the Asherim and the altars and the carven images that were meant for this God that was not the true God. They were destroying it into powder. So now we have an understanding, oh, that's what they were doing. Not they were burning trees because they were angry. They were burning down the Asherim because they wanted to destroy all signs of something that was pagan and not for the Lord. It was a good thing, okay? So, Evan, if you could do the next one. So the next thing I want to talk about is the different types of parallelism that are in the poetry books. So we have this synonymous parallelism. That is when you will see a lot of figures of speech in the poetry books, just like you would in English. You know, when you're writing a poem, it has like metaphors and similes and figurative language, and it makes it all fancy, and you're like, oh, this is so nice and so deep, and I love poetry. So that's what the Jews did. They were not any different. So, but they did it in different ways. So they had specific types of poetry extras that they used in order to have their, saying of what they would like to say. And Proverbs is really well known for it. So the first one is synonymous. And synonymous parallelism means that the second line says the same thing as the first line, but in a slightly different way. And the two lines are connected with the word and or like. So they have to use the word and or like in one of the two lines to connect, to know that, okay, these two lines go together. And the second line is going to kind of refer back to the first line in a different way, the meaning behind it. So you would have like a gold ring in a pig's snout. So a pig to the Hebrews was a very unclean animal. You do not eat pig. You do not touch and play with pig. You do not have pigs in your farm. There is no pigs because it's unclean. So they, in their mind, when they heard this proverb, gold is precious in something that is unclean and disgusting. Why would you do that, And so a gold ring in a pig's snout, okay, so second line, is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. So a woman that is valued, is important, is precious, but she doesn't show any discretion into being the way that, modest and proper, the way she should be. And so that's just like the gold ring in a pig's snout. And so it compares the two lines to give you meaning of that's what you're trying to say with the first line. Okay, do the next one. Antithetical parallelism. So then this one, the second line describes the opposite of what was described in the first line. The two lines contrast two things, and they're always connected with the word but. So we have Proverbs 10. There's Proverbs 10 has tons of this. So a wise man brings joy to his father, so that's one, but a foolish son brings grief to his mother. All Solomon had to do when he wrote the book of Proverbs is just say, a wise man brings joy to his father, the end. He doesn't have to say anything else because you get the point. If a wise son will bring happiness to his family, you don't need to know about the opposite because you know that already. But they wrote all of these other things, the contrasting back and forth, because it's poetic. It shows that he was very wise in how to accurately write poetry. That was something that was valued and treasured as an educated person. So that's how he wrote. He could have just given those tidbits of Proverbs, but he wrote it in this way for that reason. So lazy hands are made for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all wrongs. Two contrasting things. Okay, next one. Synthetic parallelism. So in this one, the second line adds information about what is said in the first line. So you have, listen, my son, accept what I say. So you're like, yes. And the years of your life will be many. So it adds on to the information that you heard in the first one, and that is called synthetic parallelism. So that's all I'm going to go for there. I just wanted to give you a little background into how they're set up and why you might see different things. Okay. So Job, for each of these books, you have Jesus shown through in some way. So I want to give you those messianic promises. In the book of Job, it talks about a future redeemer. and the resurrection from the dead that Jesus is going to come and do. In Psalms, it has so many messianic psalms that have Christ's first coming, his next coming with his return as the king, and it's just all woven out throughout the Psalms. In Proverbs, Jesus embodies the characteristics of wisdom. When it talks about wisdom, it's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Ecclesiastes, in the future, God will bring every deed into judgment, whether good or evil. God is the judge. He will have a time of judgment that will come. And Song of Solomon can be used as a typology that foreshadows Christ and the church as his bride. So, for Job, so this is the first one I just want to quickly go through. In the book of Job, history-wise, Job they think he was a king. It's the oldest book in the Bible, and they think he was a king, and that's why he had so much wealth and so much influence with his friends. His friends that came were very well-known and influential and wealthy, and so it's pretty much, when they did some research of who Job could have been, they think that it lines up that he was a king and his friends were kings of different areas that came in to visit him and see how he was doing because he was in such bad state of life. So when God so the whole lesson of the book is that life is short and difficult, but God is good, and he will make everything make sense in eternity because God is God and we're not. So in the book of Job, they have dinosaurs. I remember you had mentioned. So we have some dinosaurs that are mentioned in there that are brought up, and different animals that don't have any sort of meaning today. But we can look back, and sometimes the translations, they translate it a little off. Like sometimes it'll say something, and it's like, well, it's like an elephant, and it's not an elephant. Or maybe it's a giraffe, and it's like, it's not a giraffe. Giraffe doesn't have a huge tail, and it's like this little thing, and all these things. So it's, but it's a big animal, and that's what you're trying to get to. This animal is not alive today. It goes into the conversation between Job's three friends. It has 4 speeches and 2 speeches that God gives Job. So Job, throughout his time, it says that he never cursed God, but he kept asking to die. He kept saying, it would have better me if I'd never lived. Or, if only I could just, end my life now and see God in eternity. And you think, wow, I know life is bad, I know he's having a hard time, but why does he keep mentioning this and not cursing God? He's being careful not to curse God, but he just keeps asking to die. And he kind of mentions in there to his reason why. He says that, no man has seen God and lived. You're not, it says in the Old Testament, you have not seen God and lived. So he wants to see God. He wants to say, why is my life doing all of these bad things? What did I do, God? And so in order to do that, he says, kill me now so that I can have my court case with you. And that's where God says, oh, you want a court case? And he comes and he speaks to Job. And then Job realizes what he asked for and says, oh, I was mistaken. I am sorry. I did not mean that. Obviously, you're greater and your ways are bigger than me, and I shouldn't have ever asked for that court case, because God gives him one. And that's why he goes back and says, were you there, were you there, were you there? Because when you have a court, you have to go back into the history of who that person is in order to prove that their worthiness in this court case. So God was like, fine, we'll have this court case. This is where I was. Were you there? No. Okay. And I'm continuing on throughout history. Were you there? No. Okay. And then all the way to now. And he's like, you want to ask me why this is going on? Because I'm God. He didn't give him an answer. He just, in the end, pretty much said, because I am God. And that's the end. He can do what he wants. And we know why. We have the background with Satan going in and asking God the permission to be able to torture Job in this way. And God says yes to prove his worthiness and all of these things. But Job didn't know that. So God never gave him that answer. He just said, because I'm God. And so then, but God's upset at his friends, because his friends came in the beginning to help Job. They were there to console him. But as time went on, they said, there has to be something, Job, because even God would not do this. Even God would not bring calamity. He wouldn't bring destruction. He wouldn't bring all these things if you had a pure life. And there are psalms and words in the Bible that talk about that the Lord's protection is over the pure, that his protection are over those that are faithful, that no harm will come to them, that no evil will befall them, that all of their family will be as cedars. And you look and say, okay, well then why did it happen to Job if he was pure? So that's what his friends were thinking. That's why they kept questioning him, like, Job, there has to be something you're hiding from us. And they critiqued him. But the problem is that they looked at their worldly wisdom and not realizing, wait a minute, we serve a God who he is God. He is above us. His ways are not our ways, and we might not understand them, but we have to know that he is our God, and then we trust in that knowledge. But they didn't do that, and so God got mad at them and told Job, and he said, if you don't pray for them, then I will kill them. And so Job said, I'll pray for them. And so he offered sacrifices and prays for his friends that belittled him, that put him down, that were pointing the finger at him. He's the one that still was able to say, forgive them, God, forgive them. So I think that speaks for Job's heart. But he did that, and his friends were spared. So that is Job. When we go into the next one, Psalms. Psalms half of them were written by David. He wrote 75 of them. There was also other authors like the sons of Korah, Solomon, Moses wrote one, and anonymous writers that wrote the whole books of Psalm. So the lesson of Psalm is that we should intentionally cultivate praise and thanks to God for who he is and for what he has done in good circumstances and in bad. It doesn't matter the circumstance. We need to offer our hearts as praise to God. So Psalms was the hymn book for the Old Testament people. All of these psalms were worship songs that they put together. And so there are 150 of them. Psalms means praises in Hebrew. And they were divided into 5 books or sections after they came back. So remember how again, I haven't talked about this yet, but if you just know the general understanding of timeline with the Jews, they go into exile with Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar for 70 years. And when they come back to rebuild the temple, then they take the psalm books and they put them into sections. And so they kind of categorize them at that point when Ezra comes and he's the priest and he opens it up and they organize it. So that at that point, they put it into 5 different sections. Psalm 117 is the shortest psalm. Psalm 119 is the longest psalm. It has 176 verses. Psalm 119 is also set up as every set of 8 verses begins with a letter from the Hebrew alphabet. So all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet are put into every 8 verses that begins with the next letter in the alphabet, and so on. So it is poetic. Psalm 22, it talks about Jesus' death hundreds of years before it occurred. And there are 13 messianic psalms: 2, 8, 16, 22, 40, 45, 69, 72, 89, 102, 109, 110, 132, all talk about the Messiah. So there's a lot thrown in there all throughout Psalms. Psalm 132, it says, I will make a horn grow for David and set up a lamp for my anointed one. So do you remember when I talked, it was like week 1 or 2, and I talked about the ancient kings and how they had those horns? And the horns meant that they were king of all. They were ultimately it was like God incarnate, where it's like they are divinely chosen to be kings. They were a symbol of power in that day. So all ancients knew the horn meant power and authority and ruling. So when God uses their terminology, because he works within the culture, I will make a horn grow for David and set up a lamp for my anointed one. He's saying, I'm going to give you strength of power and authority that I'm setting up that will be there forever. And how is that going to happen? Because David doesn't live forever. It's through Jesus, through God, coming down as flesh. So, next one. Proverbs. The book of Proverbs was written by Solomon. And there was a couple others. Lemuel and Agur also wrote a couple of the Proverbs. The lesson is to think before you act. You can't control everything, but we can live wisely and avoid any negative outcomes and maximize the possibility for God-honoring and positive outcomes. So Solomon, he asked for wisdom. When he was just becoming king, God said, I can give you anything you want. What would you pick? And he thought, I could choose wealth. I could choose popularity. I need wisdom, God. So he had a clean heart, a pure heart before the Lord to ask for something. And God was so pleased with that. He said, I won't just give you wisdom. I'll also give you the wealth. I'll also give you the fame. I'll give you all of that as well because of your having your heart toward me. So wisdom is the application of knowledge. So you have the knowledge, but if you don't do anything with it, you are not wise. You have to act out what you think. And so the Hebrews were really big on that. It's like, you know it, you do it. If you don't do it, then you're a fool. You might know it. It's not a lack of knowledge. It's not like you're foolish because you didn't know. It's that you're foolish because you knew and you didn't act. You didn't have your actions equal what you know. So the word proverb in Hebrew means a comparison. So the title of Proverbs is literally the words that go before. It contrasts a wise person and a foolish one. So if you have a heart to the Lord, you will be wise because you already know God. You already have his word hidden in your heart and your mind. Now you're going to act on it. But if you don't, you're still a Hebrew. You still had to memorize the Torah when you were young. They went to Hebrew school, and they had to memorize the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Memory. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. A Jewish boy had to know by memory. So they did this, so they had it hidden. But if they didn't act on it, then you're a fool. Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. Solomon calls himself the Koheleth, which means preacher in Hebrew. The lesson is that when we expect anything other than God to fulfill us, we come up empty. So he tried everything this life could offer, and he says it's meaningless. It's written in an essay format. Even though it's a poetic form, it's not clumped together. It's written as an essay. And it's all about the purpose and meaning of life, ultimately. It's all the way through. That's the main theme. It talks about that there's a lot of injustice and life might not make sense, but there are 2 ways of looking at truth. One is a person that ignores God, and then one is a person who trusts in God. So Solomon has tried everything, and he found that everything under the sun was meaningless, meaning that life apart from God was without meaning. And then he goes into that God will bring judgment on both the righteous and the wicked. And we know that even with Romans and 2 Corinthians, it talks about the judgment seat of Christ, and that every person, whether you're a believer or non-believer, will be judged on Judgment Day. And every act and every word spoken will be laid out before God. And it talked about it in Revelation 20. So the conclusion at the end of the book, in chapter 12, 13, it says, "Now all has been heard, and here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." So he ends it with that. Song of Solomon. I'm not going to really go into that too much, but the Song of Solomon was written by Solomon. The lesson is about waiting on God's timing and staying within God's standards that allow for the blessing and in the marriage relationship. It's written as a love song, and it doesn't have a lot of prophecies or very obvious ones that we can really point to, but it does talk about, in Ephesians, it does mention about that Christ and the church will become one, and that how we're going to be his bride. And so we can take Song of Solomon and the whole emphasis of this relationship and kind of apply prophetically to those 2 groups. So Evan, I'd like for you to do the next slide. This is where we're going to go back into our timeline. So I said that when it comes to the prophets, I didn't want to just do the history books and then the major prophets and the minor prophets. I wanted to insert them where they belonged in history so you understood why they wrote what they wrote. So if you look up there, you see the point where Solomon dies, and then you have a divided kingdom, which we're going to talk about, and you have Obadiah and Joel, and then Elijah and Elisha. So Obadiah and Joel actually wrote their books before Elijah and Elisha. Then comes Jonah and Amos and Hosea and Micah and Isaiah, and that's close to the time. Jonah and Amos were right before the Israel northern kingdom falling, but then these other ones were around the time when the northern kingdom fell. And then you have some more prophets, and then you have the Judah, which is the southern kingdom that falls into captivity, and then the captives return, and then we go into Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah are very similar timeline after they come back, okay? So that's the flow that we're going to be going for the rest of this class. So you can keep that up, Evan. So for 1st and 2nd Kings, dividing the kingdom. So I had mentioned David being king. He had a son, Solomon, who became the next king. So we're still a monarchy. We have one king over all of Israel. So Solomon, he asked for wisdom. He was a great king in the beginning. And then quickly he fell. It was the things that God had said, if you ask for a king like the other nations, this is what they're going to do. He fit every one of those bill for each one of those. And I'm going to explain that. So before I do, 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one book. We had divided it when we translated it into the Greek Septuagint. They divided it into 2 books, but it was originally in Hebrew. It's still one book in Hebrew if you look at the Hebrew Bible. So it talks about Israel's first king, and then the Assyrians that come in, and the Babylonians that come in for each of those kingdoms, and they take over, and then there is no more Israel. It's gone until 1948 when they actually come back and have a country of their own. But after that point, when the other countries took over, they were scattered, and it was over. There was no Israel country anymore. But Solomon, he's doing the warnings that God gave. So number 1, God said not to make alliances with other kingdoms. So Solomon made alliances with other kingdoms. He married the daughters to solidify it. And when you would do something like that, and this is why he had so many wives, it wasn't all just, oh, I think you're pretty, I want to marry you. It wasn't like that. It was a lot of it was alliances. So in the kingdom world, back then in the ancient days, they would have it where, let's say, one kingdom and another kingdom want to have an alliance where it's like, okay, we'll help you, you help us, if we go into battle, you're going to come with us to help, and we won't fight each other. So they would exchange children, the royalty, in order to solidify it. Because if this king's daughter is married to this king's son, then he's not going to attack and destroy the kingdom because his daughter's there, and vice versa. So they would do things like that all the time. So Solomon was like, yeah, I want peace, so I'll marry, that princess and that princess and that princess and that princess and get all these kingdoms to be at peace with him so that there wouldn't be any war. But the problem was that whenever you got married, you were also expected to accept each other's gods. That was what you did. So it said, if you read when it talks about Solomon's wives, and it said he married an Egyptian princess and he brought her over, he gave her, first of all, he built a big palace just for her. And then it said that he made a temple to her gods so that she could worship her gods right there. And they are now accepted. So it's like you accept Jehovah as one of the gods that you already worship anyway, and then we accept all of your gods, and now we're okay. But God said, don't do that. That's why he said, don't do it. Don't marry into these and make these alliances because I don't want you to worship any god but me. But he did it anyway. And then the second thing, the Israelites didn't extinguish all the Canaanites like God told them to. So when they came into the promised land, they were supposed to, if you remember, God said, I will help you get rid of all the people. They disobeyed God. They didn't follow the Lord. And he's like, okay, well, my hands are off. I'm not going to take them out of the country if you aren't going to do what I said. And so they didn't get rid of the people that they needed to. So you have all these Canaanites mixed in with the Jews. And so Solomon thought, well, since they're already here and living in the land with us, in order for them not to rebel against my kingdom, I'll appease them. I'll make sure that whatever God they're worshiping, that they can do their sacrifices and worship where they are so that they feel like we can be cohesive and live together and everything's okay. That's, again, not what God wanted to do, because now the Israelites saw that and they began worshiping those gods. So you worship God, but it's okay to have Asherah poles, and it's okay to worship Baal because everyone else is doing it. And so that is where the mixing in, and it made God very angry. The third thing he did is that he redesigned Israel's tribal land boundaries. So in Judges, I said it was about tribes, about war, tribalism. It was like this was mad at this, and they were never unified until they decided to go against Benjamin. And then they were like, yes, let's do it. And they all went and killed Benjamin almost to death. And then they came back and all of those things. But there was all this tribalism, this tension of, well, that's Ephraim's land. That's not your land, Manasseh. And oh no, this is Judah's land. That's not your land, and Reuben. And it was just like all of these different frustrations. And Solomon, he thought, well, if I move the boundary lines, then no one really knows whose is whose, and they'll just stop fighting. So that's what he did. He just decided to move the lines, but then he wanted to dismantle all that power. Like, we're the country of Reuben. We're the, not country, we're the tribe of Reuben. We're the tribe of this. And he wanted to be king over all. So he moved their lines so that it was confusing enough that they didn't know whose land was whose. And it was like, well, who cares anymore? It's just land. So he did that, which made them angry. The focus was on gold. He spent double the time creating his own palace than God's temple. He made God's temple immaculate. He made it gorgeous. I mean, it says that whenever it was destroyed, that the people cried. Whenever they rebuilt it, the old people cried because it didn't look like it used to, because Solomon's temple was so beautiful. And they were so upset because it was. But you spend time on what you love, right? So he spent time on God's temple, and then he took double the time to make sure that his palace was amazing. And so the focus began to be on gold and wealth and on himself. And he's like, okay, I'll do what you want me to do, God, with the temple, but I'm going to make sure that I have a very nice area to be living in. So the next thing he did is he lavished building projects with slaves. So he enslaved the Canaanites, certain Canaanites. And remember when I said about the corvée labor, where it's like they were farmers. So they would work, and then they had this period of rest where they were waiting. And so then the king would use that to his advantage. So he says, like, since you're not working super hard all day long, you're going to work for me, and you're going to do these things. And that's what God warned the Israelites about. So that's what Solomon did. He would take the people and say, okay, now that you're done with your harvest season, everything's over, you're going to come and work for me. And you're going to do these projects, and you're going to work hard. And so he did that, and he forced all of his subjects to serve the state. This is why whenever he dies and his son comes up and the people said, please don't be as harsh as your father. And you think, why was Solomon harsh? Because that's what he did. He was able to enslave in that period of time the people where they felt like they were being abused in order to appease, Solomon and what he wanted. And so they didn't want that. They wanted freedom from that. There was an influx of pagan political and religious ideology in Jerusalem as the result of that international trade. Solomon loved international connections, so he accepted every pagan idol and every pagan god that came into his, Jerusalem, and he just set up new temples for them because he wanted to have that relationship with those countries. And finally, the revolts of the satellite states as Solomon's military power waned showed that. So the Israelites started to rebel. Like, there was certain areas that started to come up and get frustrated at Solomon and what he was doing. And so when they were rebelling, he had to tax the Israelites in order to pay for people to be like soldiers to keep the peace. So all the taxes went up. And so it became into this like top-heavy bureaucracy. I can't talk right this day. But it was where it's like Solomon was trying to get even though wealth was so prevalent, he was trying to get more and more to be able to give the people that were helping him enough money to keep the peace from the people that he was abusing that were revolting against him. And it kind of got out of hand. And then he dies. And so he has a son. I put it over here. His son, Rehoboam. And Rehoboam, he's young, not very experienced, and he says, so the people say, please don't be as harsh with us as your father. Please give us rest and peace from the land. And so he goes and asks his buddies, what should I do? And his buddies were like, tell him that you're going to be even harsher. Tell him that, that your finger is like your father's waist. And that you are going to make sure that they have, if your father whipped you with whips, I'm going to whip you with scorpions. I'm going to make it so hard on you. And then the wisdom, the elders were like, no, you need to tell them that they are going to have peace and rest because otherwise you're going to have a revolt. Well, he listens to his buddies. And then he says that to the people. And then there's civil war. And it just breaks out. And the country is divided. So 10 tribes have always been jealous of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. So we have, this was Israel, and this is the northern kingdom called Israel. That's what they call themselves. And the southern kingdom was called Judah. When they broke off, Rehoboam became king of the southern. And then Jeroboam became king of the northern. Jeroboam was just a commander. He wasn't of royal blood. He was a commander in the office of the army of Solomon. And so whenever Rehoboam set himself up and said that to the Israelites and they got all upset and they started breaking out in war, he took this to go against Rehoboam, and he actually was accepted by Israel in the northern kingdom as their king. So now we have a line that's split. Instead of Israel having king, 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 you have, well, the northern kingdom has kings, the southern kingdoms have kings. And it's like two different countries. It's totally split. And there are 10 tribes that go up here and 2 tribes that go at the bottom. The 2 tribes at the bottom are Judah and Benjamin, and then all the other tribes of Israel are at the northern kingdom. Their prime enemy became Assyria. And Assyria, if you remember on that map, which I'll refer back to probably next week, but they became very, very big. It was like, you're talking about having a one world government. That's what Assyria wanted. And they just kept conquering and conquering and conquering. And they came against Israel. And Israel was, without God, helpless. And they fell to them. But before we get into that, I wanted to go into Obadiah, because this is where, in the timeline, is where we become next. So Obadiah wrote his book. He was considered a minor prophet. So if you didn't know, the difference between major prophets and minor prophets does not mean significance or importance or what they said or didn't say. It just comes down to how big is the book. Is it a long book? It's a major. If it's a short book, it's a minor. That's it. So in English, we think, well, major is more important, but it's not. That's not what it meant. It's like if we called these books are the long ones and these are the short ones, that's what it meant in the Hebrews. So they're all important. So the minor prophets, Obadiah, it was during King Jehoram's reign. He spoke to the Israelites. He pretty much brought Evan, if you could do the next slide. There is a slide. Okay. So he brought judgment on Edom. So you see the kingdom of Edom. At the bottom, you have the kingdom of Israel, kingdom of Judah, which is, the southern, and then the kingdom of Edom, which is underneath Judah. So Edom were descendants of Esau. So you have Jacob and Esau. His descendants were Edom. So Obadiah said they were wicked. They were very wicked people. And so he said that there will be no survivors from Esau, thus saith the Lord. The Lord has spoken. And they got destroyed by the Assyrians. And today there are no descendants of Edom that can be found. They were totally wiped out. And so the whole book is, about pretty much a prophecy against them for rejecting the Lord. So the other thing that he talks about is this big term called Day of the Lord. So when you read Revelation, it gets pretty exciting. And you're like, oh, this is happening, this is happening. And then it gets really confusing. And you're like, whoa, I don't understand. What does this mean? Why is this happening? And it's because you just read Revelation. So God, remember, he has this progressive revelation. So it's like if you only focused on Genesis when it comes to the Messiah, and you didn't read any other book, you would think, well, I know that he's going to be born from a woman. But that's it, really. And Abraham's in there. So, and I know he's from Abraham's line, but that's all the clues you have. But as you continue to read, the Lord reveals, oh, and he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Oh, and he's going to be pierced for your transgressions. Oh, and he continues to give you more and more information. And you're like, oh, okay. So it's the same thing with Revelation. If you just read Revelation, you're like, wow, it's really confusing. I don't understand. But when you start reading the other books that relate to the end times, then it becomes this big picture and you understand it. So Daniel is another huge one. Daniel and Revelation, they really go hand in hand, but so do the prophets. And sometimes we don't take that, we don't realize that. But when they talk about the day of the Lord, it has two meanings. Sometimes they use it in the term of God's judgment is coming now. This is the day of the Lord, Israel. You will be judged. An enemy is going to come and destroy you, okay, like Babylon. Then he says the day of the Lord in the end of the days. And the day of the Lord there, this is used by almost every prophet. Every major and minor prophet has some sort of day of the Lord in it. And that's referring to the end times. So in Obadiah, he uses day of the Lord quite often. And he's talking about this end time fulfillment. So the first half, or the second half of his book, it talks about the end time events, the tribulation period, the kingdom age is in Obadiah. It's not just Revelation. So, as you can see, that's where everything is. And I wanted to mention too that the kingdom of Israel, they had their capital that was different than Judah's. So, as of right there, Samaria was their capital, and then in Judah, the southern kingdom, it was still Jerusalem that had it. And because Jerusalem was the city of David, and David's line was Rehoboam, who was the king of the southern kingdom. Okay, so Joel, the next person, the next minor prophet that spoke at this time, he spoke to southern Israel, the kingdom of Judah, and this was during King Ahaziah, and Joash. They were kings during his day. He again talks about the day of the Lord. So at this time, there was a severe drought, and there was a lot of locust invasions that had come in and eaten all the food. And so he said, you see, Israel, the Lord's allowing this to happen because you've turned your back on him. If you would just repent and turn your hearts to the Lord, he would bring in the wealth. He would bring in the fertility of the land. But because you've hardened your hearts, God's allowed the drought. He's allowed the locust to come. And then he goes into, now that I'm talking about this, of the Lord's judgment, let me tell you about the end times. And he goes and says this day of the Lord and how that the Lord is going to judge Israel, but that they will turn their hearts back to the Lord in the end. And he goes into detail about the tribulation period, about the return of the Messiah, about the future millennial kingdom. All of that is in this really small book of Joel. So in chapter 2, verse 32, he says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. So there's this thing, and I'm not going to go into it now because I want to have a separate class on the whole end time Daniel Revelation thing. But I wanted to tell you that he goes into detail about how that there will be a remnant, and it's also backed up in Zechariah, Matthew, and Romans, that there will be a remnant of Jews in the end times, in the end days, that will realize. So it's like the people that are killed, the Jews that are killed during the whole tribulation and everything, that will happen, just like every other person that's on this earth that's alive. There will be those that die, but there will be some that make it to the end. And when those Jews that make it to the end will all get saved, they will realize Jesus is the Messiah. He has come, and we've rejected him, and they will repent and turn their hearts back to him as a remnant of the rest of the Jews that are left. So they will, in the end, turn their hearts. Right now, they aren't. Right now, as a country, they've rejected Jesus. But there will be a day, and God said that they will acknowledge that Jesus is the Messiah and turn their hearts to him. And then in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 of Joel, it says, in those days and at that time, I will restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. I will gather all the nations and bring them down. There I will put on trial for them what they did to my inheritance, my people Israel, because they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. So this is when the Israelites were all scattered. There is no longer a country of Israel. And God, even though he allowed those things to happen, he allowed the countries to come in and take over, they still have to give an account for what they did. And so because they came and took the land away from the Jews, and they took them and scattered them across the land, they will be called to judgment and will have to accept the consequences for that. Joel also talks about this great end time battle, Armageddon, that will take place in the same general timeline as Israel's restoration. So the tribulation period is from chapter 3, 9 through 16, verse 9 through 16 talks about the tribulation. You can compare that with Revelation 19. It's very, very good parallel. And then he goes into the millennial kingdom, and you can compare that with Revelation 20. So we'll come back to that later. But the last thing I wanted to do before we end the class is that we could jump back to Elijah and Elisha. So Elijah and Elisha, there's been talk about Elijah being one of the two witnesses in the tribulation period. There's going to be these two witnesses in Revelation 11 that are going to come and preach, and they're going to be able to call down fire from heaven and consume their enemies, and then at one point they will be allowed to die. And so something, like they'll be, up to that point, no one can hurt them. But then something happens where it says that they're able to be killed. And the people will lay out their bodies in the streets and mock and be so excited. Look what we did. We killed the men that were tormenting us. And then they'll come back from the grave. They'll wake up and then come back. And so what had happened is like there's all this talk about who are those two witnesses. And so some people think it's Moses and Elijah because those are the ones that appeared when Jesus was on the earth and they went and talked with him. And so they thought, well, those could be the two witnesses, meaning that Elijah is the prophetic and Moses is the law. Okay? So that's how they explain their reasoning. And then the other people will say, well, no, it's Enoch and Elijah. So remember, Enoch, he didn't die. It says that he was pleasing the Lord and then the Lord just took him up and he was done. He was gone. And then Elijah, he gets in the whirlwind, so he actually has never faced death either. So because those are the two men mentioned in the Bible that haven't died, Moses died, then those are the two witnesses because God chose them for that purpose and didn't allow them to die on the earth. Okay? So I'm not telling you which one's right. I'm just telling you the two options that people have said that could be. So Elijah, his rapture is very prophetic. In 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, it refers back to Elijah's rapture as being the foreshadow to the church's rapture, that as they are whisked up, so will the church be whisked up in the rapture. The Greek word for caught up, they would say is caught up, is harpazo, and it means a sudden physical snatching away. So when the Bible was translated to Latin, harpazo came to the Latin word, make sure I spell it right, rapturo. Okay? And that is where we get our modern word rapture. So I've seen these videos online where it'll say, rapture is never mentioned in the Bible. Well, yes, of course, because you're not reading a Latin Bible, and that with the original word was the same general meaning, it just wasn't the exact one. Just like, well, the word, he ran away, or the phrase he ran away isn't in the original Bible anyway, because that was Hebrew and Greek, and that's not in the Hebrew and Greek. So it's very, I just think you have to watch what you listen to. Some people will make this big video to become famous on YouTube and say, oh, the Bible doesn't say, but they haven't done any research. They just run with a thought without doing their background, and it's just, that's a foolish thing to do. So this is rapture, and harpazo is mentioned in the Bible in the Greek, and it means to be caught up physically. So yes, technically it still is in the Bible. Okay. So Elisha requests, so when Elijah's ready to leave, Elisha is his second-hand man, his servant that has followed him along, and he asks for a double portion. So Elijah, so far, if you count how many miracles that were written with Elijah, he did 7 different accounts. And so Elisha says, I want a double blessing, Lord. Give me a double blessing. And so Elijah said, if you see me being caught up into heaven, then God is saying you will receive a double portion. Otherwise, it won't be. So he follows him around like a puppy, so knows that this is the day. I want to make sure I see him. And so it says that when Elijah gets caught up, he sees it. He sees the whole event, his cape. So that was important too. It was like a prophet wore a cape, and it was like the symbol of authority, kind of like you would have a king's royal robes. A prophet had one too. So his cape and his staff were left whenever Elijah got caught up. And it said, so Elisha knew, so he picks up the cape, puts it on his back, takes the staff, and then touches the water, and it parts. And he knows that the Lord has given him this request. So if you count how many miracles that Elisha did, so Elijah did 7, Elisha did 15. He did get that double portion of miracles compared to Elijah. So we're going to stop there, and we will continue with more next week. But is there any questions with what I had talked about today? No? I know.
Everybody's got questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What was the meaning for Hebrew?
Ecclesiastes. Let me pull back just to make sure I have it. I don't know what the meaning of the word Ecclesiastes is. I just know that Solomon called himself the preacher in it. He called himself, which is Hebrew for preacher. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's interesting that the book of Job is considered a book of poetry, because I might have looked at it more as a history book. So when I look at it now as a poetry book, and I think, what is God Job, he feared God, and he was very wealthy. So God was with him. And going back to what you had shared in the previous weeks about having a contract,
Mm-hmm.
Job had no contract with God, right? He was not under the Abrahamic covenant.
Right.
So it's interesting that someone can still fear God, be blessed by God, but God doesn't have a contract with them. So God's not obligated. He offered him protection, but he was not required to. And so if you're reading this thousands of years ago, a couple things that kind of jump out is, one, is you fear God, because if such a righteous man as this, who's become so wealthy, can be struck by God, and that's where his friends come in, right? They're trying to scrutinize and find something's wrong with them. But what if it's not? What if it's, I mean, I can come back to that again in a second, but the second part is that because he was so wealthy, and it says that he resisted evil, but that did not carry down into his children, right? His 7 sons and 3 daughters. And some will say, well, see, God brought destruction upon him because of his children. And I would say God didn't bring destruction upon him, but he brought destruction upon his line. So he destroyed his branches. He destroyed his heritage because his children were foolish and evil. And the other part that goes along with that is he was so wealthy that he would go and make sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
So if a wealthy man who has wicked children, but yet he's also always making sacrifices, a common person couldn't make that great amount of sacrifices. So again, here's an image of a rich man, and we oftentimes people can look at themselves compared to, oh, if I was a rich man, my troubles would be gone. And here's and so if I'm a commoner, or if I'm in the library and if I'm reading this, and I'm reading about Job, and I think it would hit me that, wow, he had so much wealth, and he poured so much of his wealth into trying to remove the sins off of his children, and that even that didn't remove their judgment. It didn't remove the date of the Lord for their lives when it came. So it shows that you are to fear the Lord, and even for believers can sometimes think, well, my sins are covered. Dad's taking care of it. Jesus paid the price, and his blood is always on the altar. So I can go and live as I please. And I think that this is an example of where, no, you better fear the Lord. You better not be acting out of committing sins purposefully, knowing that, oh, well, my sins are covered. It's like God's going to cut off your heritage. He's going to turn you into a numb. And he was blessed later on, and maybe it's because he became wiser after the fact, right? So, the Lord honored him, and he allowed him to grow new sprouts, right? Like he blessed a new heritage, but not the one that was living wickedly. So, more of a poetry book as something that you can read and relate to, as opposed to a history book where you're just trying to gain the facts.
Yeah, the parts, there was the history, though, at the beginning. The poetry came in with the speeches and stuff and how it was interacting. But yeah, the whole thing together is a poetic book that was used. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, have a great day, and I will see you next week for week 7.